So, a few days ago, Military Aviation History Channel published a video, which was an interview with Justin Bronk, a senior analyst at RUSI. RUSI is a British think tank that covers the military world, conflict, geopolitics, and so on. The interesting was about the situation in Ukraine. It was a very interesting interview, and if you haven't watched it, I warmly invite you to watch it. However, there are some points in the video that I would like to discuss because maybe I have a different point of view. And we are talking about the lessons learned from the conflict. So this is a reaction video to what NATO should learn from the conflict in Ukraine. First, a big thank you to Chris for letting me use some extracts from the original video. Second, Justin Bronk is an esteemed professional. I am just an amateur. So I may be completely wrong here because he knows some stuff that I don't. Please consider it. However, I am not questioning in any way the information, the factual information that he has provided in the video. Actually, some of the Justin articles have been my sources in a few videos. He has access to sources that I don't have, so I am expecting that his information is factually correct. This video is more about the interpretation of these facts, and in any case, we definitely agree on way more stuff than we disagree. I am also 100% sure of his intellectual honesty. I am sure he's not pushing any hidden agenda or is not affected by any partisanship. And in the same way, I am 100% sure that the way Chris edited the interview is faithful to the interview itself. And finally, I hope that there will be the possibility to discuss these points with Justin one day. And now, with no further ado, let's get started.
You can have a really capable multi-role force on paper. And if you don't fly enough and you don't exercise enough in real life as well as synthetically with all the different joint force components and all the different enablers and different types of assets that would be required to make that work in practice, then your crews won't be able to do it when you ask them to, and therefore your multi-role capability doesn't actually exist. It's that first lesson will be, look at what they weren't able to do versus what their Air Force should have been capable of on paper. And so, that should be a really sobering lesson for a lot of NATO Air Forces who have tried to maintain this front line on way less money than you actually need to run that properly. And so basically have ended up with relatively hollow forces that they just can't afford to fly enough or exercise enough with, especially, buy enough munitions to actually be usable.
Well, it is impossible to disagree with this. Training is extremely important, and it is almost self-evident. Aircraft and all the equipment that is actually necessary to make them work are extremely complex. There is probably nothing more complex than a modern fighter jet. It's the most complex piece of technology ever thought by humans. And training doesn't mean just pilots, it means all the other personnel that is actually required to keep the aircraft efficient, to keep the weapons efficient, and it is a large infrastructure that you can't do without, and it is as essential as the aircraft itself. So the risk of having a hollow force is indeed real, and we may say that up to a point the Russians found themselves exactly in that situation. I have some reservations about the fact that the Russians would train in the same way NATO would do, even if they had the resources but yes, training is extremely important, there's no denying it. However, it's the step beyond that leaves me a bit dubious. I don't think that the limiting factor of the size of an air force should be of the force that you can keep trained. So please consider that the lifespan of an aircraft, particularly in conditions with no generalized conflicts like we have been for almost a century now, is definitely longer than the flying career of a military pilot. A pilot flies in combat for 10-15 years, while an aircraft can, stay in service for 30 years, even longer sometimes. And the aircraft will remain current if it is continuously updated. Obviously, there are some limits to the updates that you can do to an old airframe, and actually airframes do get old, they can be rejuvenated, but it is a complicated job. Sometimes it's worth doing, sometimes it's not. So I am wondering if it's not worth actually acquiring the number and the types of aircraft that you deem necessary for the mission that is given to the Air Force, even though you don't have enough trained personnel. I am wondering if a viable model for the European NATO would be to have a small core of well-trained, very well-trained personnel and a large reserve of partially trained personnel, sort of similar to the National Guard if you want, that could be brought up to the level in a few months, 1 year, in case the international tensions are going to accumulate and a major conflict is at the horizon. In this way, you can keep the running expenses low, but still have the possibility to scale up in case there is the necessity without having to rebuild everything from scratch. So building everything from scratch may require 5 years, 10 years, but while in this case you may have a ready force in 6 months, 1 year. In this way the running costs are kept low. And if you really end up in one of those crises where you need to scale up, well, in that case, money is no object.
Or they need, in order to afford the munitions, the training, the tempo, to actually have a credible, really, really usable frontline force in terms of what it's supposed to be able to do. Or they'll need a lot more money if nations don't want to cut back on that other stuff. Or they need to say, just make a policy choice and say, our Air Force doesn't have the mass or the money, therefore we're not even going to try and invest in that stuff. We're not going to buy fast jets. Mm-hmm. We might buy some really, some fairly cheap ones to do quick reaction alert just to defend our own airspace, but we're not going to even pretend to invest in all that high-end stuff. And instead, we're going to specialize in, tanker provision or mobility or whatever happens to be, all of which are highly important. But at the moment, too many air forces are trying to pretend they can do too much with a very limited budget. And that means that you end up with this hollow force. And we'd probably find a lot of nations would have exactly the same issues the Russians have had.
I believe that Justin in this case is referring to some large European NATO countries like Germany, Italy, or Spain, whose air forces are numerically rather important, but the capability of generating sorties or executing some of the missions can be questionable at times. However, I don't agree with this vision that if you can't do it well, it's probably better not doing it at all. Because this means that every military involvement will be in the context of coalition. Could be NATO, could be the European Union. And despite the fact that it has always been like this in the last few decades, this is no longer a guarantee. NATO was born to face the threat of the Soviet Union, and it actually managed to survive after the fall of the Soviet Union as a way of coordinating the military instruments of a number of countries that are normally considered within the influence of the United States, and they are sort of loosely named the Western world. However, this alliance is way less compact than you may think. The automatic mechanisms of the Article 5 and the other provisions in the treaty are just words on paper. When the penny drops, every country will act according to its own interests. It's always been like this in history, to be honest, so this is nothing new. If the Russian invaded the Baltics or any other NATO country, the automatic mechanisms may start involving every country in the war, but you have no guarantee that this will keep going. Public opinions may well stop these wars and these involvements. So, for a relatively large country, for a relatively important industrial power, relinquishing capabilities because now there are not the funds to keep them up to date Well, I don't think it's a reasonable policy. So what is the solution? Well, in part we have already discussed the possibility to have a strong and well-structured reserve force, and this is one solution. The other one is to incentivize the domestic defense industry. I know some people will be jumping on the chair, some people will tell me stick to planes, and don't worry, I will keep sticking to planes in the future. We often see the defense expenses as if it was just that, an expense that has no return. It's not an investment, it's just an expense. Well, this is not true in general. If you acquire all your military capabilities abroad, yes, of course, in this case is an expense that more often than not also generates debt, which is a bad thing, in the sense foreign debt is a bad thing for a country. But if you acquire at least part or the majority of your military equipment from your national industry, all of these are investments. This is money that remains within the country. This is money that stimulates the economy. This is money that stimulates occupation. And usually this is quite a high-tech occupation, so something of value for the country. The model that I have in mind is France, that, well, it's not perfectly still acquiring a non-negligible portion of its equipment abroad, but is also a net producer and a net exporter of military equipment. They have quite a large autonomy, and if they were in the condition of not depending from abroad, well, they could get there if they wanted. So these are my considerations. This is something that I'm offering you as something to think about and discuss about. I may be completely wrong, and if you think that I am, please let me know in the comments below. In the meanwhile, thank you very much for watching this video, and thank you very much to all those who are supporting the channel on Patreon or by being a member. I will never thank you enough. There is a new way of supporting the channel by buying an aircraft model from Air Models. There will be an affiliate link below. I will get a small percentage at no extra cost for you. And finally, a great way to help the channel is clicking on the videos that are going to appear beside me. This is a great way of telling the YouTube algorithms this is a good video. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.